Sorry.
I'm sharing my screen. Share, okay. And now you should be seeing it fully. Yes.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Okay.
Perfect. You have
thank
20
you.
minutes. Thank you so
Perfect.
much.
Thank you very much for all the participants being here. And this paper is great because it's co-authored with Eugenia, who is presenting another paper. So we also have Eugenia here. And it's about capital flows management measures and dollarization. Oops. Then this, I'm going faster than, okay, let me go there. Okay, so financial dollarization is a concern for many emerging markets in general because they imply high currency risk exposure. In Latin America, countries such as Brazil, Peru, and Uruguay have implemented capital control measures and macroprudential regulation to reduce this currency risk. However, we don't understand much the mechanism behind this measure or how they contribute on reducing systemic risk and financial currency exposure. And these aspects are very relevant, especially due to the high volatility of capital flows in emerging economies. And this is especially a concern because of the consequences of unconventional monetary policy that advanced economies carried out in the last years and the potential effect on credit in emerging markets. So given this background and thinking about emerging economies, in this paper, we are going to look at the systemic and bank level effect of implementing reserve requirement in foreign currency in a heavy dollarized country. And we study this from an empirical and theoretical perspective. We are going to ask 3 specific questions on the effect of this reserve requirement. First, how effective are these measures to counteract the credit boom that QE generated in emerging economies? QE thinking about the quantitative easing programs and as part of the unconventional monetary policies that advanced economies carried out in the last few years. Second, what is the—
Gloria, can I stop you a second to ask you something?
Yes.
You are thinking of just reserve requirements for the central bank or reserve requirements for private banks in the central bank?
For private banks in the central bank.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Second, what is their effect on credit and deposit dollarization? And third, do banks react different to the reserve requirement if they have different ex-ante holdings of deposits in foreign currency? What we're going to do is we are going to take Peruvian data, Peruvian bank level data from 2004 until 2017, and we are going to empirically look at the effect of a reserve requirement in deposits in foreign currency, and at the effects of this reserve requirement in deposits in foreign currency, the effect of this has on credit and deposit dollarization as a function of the bank currency exposure on deposits. And we are going to use what we call this bank foreign funding ratio, or FFR, and we define it as the ratio between deposits in US dollars to total credit. We are going to take the result from the empirical part, and we are going to build a small open economy model with banks and financial frictions a la Carter, Kiyotaki, and Karadi, and we are specifically going to introduce financial dollarization and heterogeneity in banks' currency exposure in this FFR measure. We calibrate the model to the Peruvian economy. We are going to model an increase in capital flows that is going to be related to the quantitative easing policy of the US, and we're going to introduce then a reserve requirement on deposits in foreign currency, and we're going to analyze how this policy managed to control the credit boom prompted by the QE policy. So let me tell you, like, straightforward the findings of our research. First, from our empirical part, we learned that banks respond different to a reserve requirement depending on their ex-ante currency exposure, depending exactly on this FFR measure. And in particular, banks with a higher currency exposure reduce more their deposit dollarization, while they increase their credit dollarization vis-a-vis banks with a low FFR. And second, the reserve requirement smooth the credit boom caused by the capital inflows by controlling the credit in foreign currency and credit dollarization. So jumping into the empirical part, Peru has a highly dollarized financial system and has been going through a process of de-dollarization. So in this figure, we can see, so the dashed lines are the deposit dollarization, and the solid line corresponds to the credit dollarization, and this goes from 2008 until 2018. And we see how dollarization in deposit and credit has been going down over time. And to weather the financial crisis, basically due to the quantitative easing program, the quantitative easing program carried out by the Fed, the Peruvian Central Bank used reserve requirement actively to counteract this effect. This is among other tools, of course, that the central bank uses. So here in this figure, I'm showing in solid line the reserve requirement in foreign currency, and the dashed line corresponds to the deposit in foreign currency. The shaded areas correspond to the different periods of QE from the Fed. And what we can see here is that during the QE episodes, the reserve requirement increased heavily. So basically on the first QE, we see actually the reserve requirement was kind of like, moved very little. And then with during QE, during the first QE, it increased a lot. For the second QE, it increased like a little bit afterwards, but then also during the third QE, the central bank used actively the reserve requirement. So we are going to take monthly bank level data, as I said, from 2004 until 2017. And we are going to take typical bank variables. We have credit and deposits by currency, net worth, rate of return on assets, ratio of equity to total assets. And we are also include the foreign funding ratio, that is our this is one of our key variables. We define it as the average ratio between deposits in US dollars and total credit between 2007 and 2008. So this is before the QE start. We also include the reserve requirement. We also include, the country level data like typical macro variables. So our econometric model that we want to study is how both credit and deposits in dollars, credit and deposits in dollars, the total and dollarization. So for these three, for credit and for deposits, how this change, how these outcome variables change with the different control variables. And we are particularly interested in the interaction term of reserve requirement and the bank foreign funding ratio. Reserve requirement and the bank foreign funding ratio. Because it captures exactly the heterogeneity in the impact of the reserve requirement on the bank's performance across banks with the different ex-ante FFR. We're going to estimate this regression for different periods and with and without time fixes. And now I'm going to show you the results of the partial effect of the reserve requirement for different level of FFR, and which is actually going to be like the sum of omega-1 and omega-2 times the ratio. So here is basically what we're showing is the sum of omega-1 and omega-2 times the ratio of the foreign funding ratio. And so let me go like little by little to explain you these figures. So here we are plotting. So how for different levels of FFR, the different outcome variables. So in dashed lines, we have credit. So the first figure corresponds to foreign currency, for foreign currency credit and deposits. The second for total credit and deposits, and the third for dollarization in credit and in total deposits. And we see how, and the vertical lines corresponds to the median banks, and the shaded area represents the 95% interval for each of the lines. So the deposit lines are in solid and the dashed lines corresponds to credit. And so looking at the figures for the median banks, so the red line, we see a significant effect on total, on foreign currency, on total credit for foreign currency, and on the total credit and on the dollarization of credit, but we don't see an effect for the median of these variables for the deposit ones. And then, so this is like the first snapshot looking at the median variables, but we can also look at the heterogeneity on the ex-ante FFR. And if we look at the deposit variables, so the solid lines, foreign currency deposits decrease for higher levels of FFR, and so does total deposits, and so does deposit dollarization. So basically the reserve requirement is affecting more deposits in banks with lower foreign funding ratio. This is like this negative slope of the deposit variables. Now, if we look at the effects on the credit variables, the green shaded areas, the effect is reversed. And so banks that have a higher ratio in foreign currency deposits, banks that have a higher ratio in foreign currency deposits with respect to total credit are going to react less to changes in reserve requirement with respect to the different measures of deposit, but are reacting more with respect to the different measures of credit. So I think this was a little bit confusing, but just like, let me sum it up here. So the reserve requirement reduces the foreign currency credit, total credit, and credit dollarization for the median bank. There's no significant effect for the median bank for neither of the deposit variables. And we find an heterogeneous effect depending on this ex-ante level of the foreign funding ratio. So banks with high foreign funding ratio, so that were on the right hand side of the figures, reduce their deposits in foreign currency, total and deposit dollarization relatively more than banks with low foreign funding ratio, but banks with low foreign funding ratio, so those that were more to the left, reduce their credit in foreign currency, total and dollarization ratio relatively more than banks with high level of foreign funding ratio. We do run several robustness checks and the results hold. So these kind of like crosses that we find between the credit and the deposits variables hold. So we have for different periods, taking out time fixed effect. We have a subsample looking only at the largest banks, also a subsample of firms versus household credit, and the differential reserve requirement in deposits in dollars and deposits in soles, and the marginal rather than the average reserve requirement. And so we are always looking at these like cross results. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try to replicate basically this heterogeneous effect on to try to understand it through a model. So the model is going to be a small open economy with banks and financial frictions a la Gerger, Kiyotaki, and Harari, and we're going to introduce two main features that are financial dollarization in credits and deposits, and we see it in the data for Peru, as in McKinsey and Peralto, and we are going to have heterogeneity in banks' foreign funding ratio. We're going to look at the quantitative easing shock. So basically, it's going to be an unexpected increase in deposits in foreign currency. And then the central bank's response is going to be a reserve requirement in foreign currency on deposits to counteract the credit boom triggered by the quantitative easing policy. We have 4 general agents in the economy, households that are going to use labor income, and the flow of profit from financial and non-financial firms to consume and save. And basically, they're going to be saving through domestic deposits. Then we have capital producing firms that are going to use final output to make new capital subject to adjustment costs a la Cristiano et al. And this is going to give us an endogenous price for capital goods. And this is an important part of the mechanism. Then we have non-financial firms that are going to produce a tradable good. So that is going to be consume, invest, and use for the capital production. And they're going to finance themselves with loans from banks in domestic and foreign currency. And banks are going to be operating both in domestic and foreign currency. And we're going to have heterogeneity in the banks to replicate a high and a low foreign funding ratio bank. And these banks are going to face borrowing constraints, like Berkshire, Kiyotaki, and Karath. So the next slide is the only slide that we have with equations from the model. This is for me, it's a big improvement because I usually present the whole model. So just going into the details of the banking system and but to what we think is the most relevant part here. So the balance sheet of the bank that is operating in domestic and foreign currency is going to be the total loans that they make to non-financial firms. So basically, this is corresponds to the loans in domestic currency and in foreign currency. And the ones in foreign currency are adjusted by the real exchange rate. So the value of the total loans are going to be equal to the deposits in domestic currency, the deposits in foreign currency translated into soles. And these are going to be subject to, on the one hand, the QE shock. So basically, we're going to have, when QE increases, these foreign currency deposits are going to increase. And then these are going to be the part of the banks that are going to be subject to the reserve requirement that corresponds also. So here we have the reserve requirement. So basically, a part of these deposits are going to have to be held. So a part of these deposits from private banks will have to be held at the central bank, and they won't be used to make loans to the firms. And we also have the net worth of the banks. We have this, as I was saying, we have heterogeneity in banks. So we're going to have a banks with a high foreign funding ratio and a bank with a low ratio. And this is going to be basically defined at the steady state through the ratio as we define it in the empirical part. That is basically the ratio between the total deposit in foreign currency over the total loans that the banks are making. And following this literature, we have a borrowing constraint with limited enforcement. So basically, the value of the banks, or how much the bank might be running away with, has to be greater or equal to, the value of the bank has to be greater or equal to how much the bank might run away with. And this is a fraction theta of the total loans. And here, total loans, again, are the sum of loans in domestic and in foreign currency. And this, we also have this part of home bias that comes from McKinsey and Caralto, that it's also triggering, or it also has a consequences of having the different foreign funding ratio for the two banks. So we're going to have a borrowing constraint for the high banks and a borrowing constraint for the low banks. So now, going into the model and trying to understand the mechanism behind our empirical results, first I'm going to show you the impact on the quantitative easing shock, then the effectiveness of the reserve requirement, and then the heterogeneity, or the role that the foreign funding ratio heterogeneity plays on the reaction on this reserve requirement. And I'm going to compare the model with the data on the figure that I show you from the empirical part. So now, trying to understand first the impact on the quantitative easing shock, we are going to have an increase in the deposit in foreign currency, and this is going to prompt a decrease in the deposit in domestic currency. Basically, there's going to be a crowd out of domestic currency deposits. Now, total deposits are going to fail because basically the banks are financed by deposit in domestic currency, and deposit dollarization is going to increase. Now, because the rate of return on deposits is falling, banks are going to have a higher net worth, and with this higher net worth, are going to be able to make more loans in foreign currency, and total credit is actually gonna be able to go up. So, and this increase in total credit is gonna be driven by credit in foreign currency, while credit in domestic currency is gonna fall, following the decrease in credit in domestic, the deposits in domestic currency. And again, credit dollarization is gonna increase after the QE. So with QE, we have an increase in dollarization in deposits and in credit, and an increase in deposit and credit in foreign currency, while total deposits decrease, but total credit increases due to this increase in net worth from the bank. Now, because we have the financial accelerator, and we have an increase in total credit, investment is going to increase, consumption on impact will increase, and we are going to see only a decrease in output on impact on the first period because of the real exchange rate reaction. So now looking at the different effects on high versus low type of banks. So here, these 4 figures corresponds to the high banks, and these 4 correspond to the low banks, and they are they have the same structure. So we see that the banks react differently. So for high banks, corresponds to banks that rely heavily on deposits in foreign currency. So their deposits in foreign currency are actually going to increase, and they're going to be actually crowding out the deposit in foreign currency from the low banks. And because the deposits in foreign currency of high banks are increasing, their credit is going to increase, so they're going to be lending more to the non-financial firms. So credit and deposit dollarization for high banks is going to be going up. Now, low banks, as I said, they are facing a crowding out from the high banks in terms of deposit in foreign currency, so their deposit dollarization will fall. But because of the the rate of returns, they are able to make more loans in foreign currency. So actually, their credit in foreign currency is going to go up, but their credit dollarization on impact will be falling. And this heterogeneous reaction is relevant because it's gonna give us part of the excess or the crosses that we see that we saw on the empirical. So now, if we add to this quantitative shock this quantitative easing shock, the reserve requirement, and this corresponds to the green line, we see that from the beginning, the reserve requirement smoothed the effect of the deposit in foreign currency. So this smoothed effect on the deposit in foreign currency is going to be, we're going to see the effects on all the variables in the model. So basically, total deposits will be falling less, dollarization in deposits is also going to increase less. The total, the total credit in the economy is going to increase less, and so the credit dollarization and investment, consumption, and output are also going to be reacting less due to the reserve requirement. When we look at the different effects on the high and the low banks, actually it's a similar story to the previous figures. The variables are reacting less with the reserve requirement than without the reserve requirement. So then we looked at these crosses that we try to replicate what we found in the empirical part from the model. And when we look at the foreign currency part for deposit and for credit, so again, deposit here corresponds to the solid line and the dashed lines correspond to credit, while on the x-axis we have the foreign funding ratio. So from low values of the foreign funding ratio to high values of the foreign funding ratio, and the red lines here corresponds to the median bank from the empirical part, while the dots corresponds to the dot or the star or the triangle correspond to the values of the high and the low banks in our model. Just like to have kind of a representative high bank and a representative low bank. And so for foreign currency, we actually managed to replicate the effects that we found in the empirical part. So for high values of the foreign funding ratio. Foreign currency credit is reacting less than for low foreign funding ratio, while for the deposits are also are actually reacting more. Oh, sorry, here I'm confusing a lot between less and more, but we have like the negative slope for the deposits in foreign currency and the positive slope for the deposits for the credit in foreign currency. When we look at total deposit and total credit, we have the negative slope for the total deposits, but we are not able to manage the positive slope on total credit. And for dollarization, we are able to match the slope on credit dollarization, but not on deposit dollarization. We think that this might be a consequence of not of the way that we have of the complementarity that we have on credit on domestic and foreign currency. So we are trying to think of a way of changing this complementarity, like, to have like instead of summing just like the two foreign currency loans and domestic currency loans, maybe having a CES or some kind of substitutability between the two. So just to conclude, banks' response to the reserve requirement in foreign currency depend on their ex-ante currency exposure. So basically banks with a relative higher currency exposure ratio reduce more their deposit dollarization while they increase their credit dollarization vis-a-vis banks with low foreign funding ratio. The reserve requirement in foreign currency managed to partially smooth the credit boom-like consequence of capital inflows that resembles the QE policy carried out by the Fed by reducing credit in foreign currency and credit dollarization. So thank you very much.
Is there any question? No. So I think we can move to Eugenia.
Great, thanks. I will share.
You have 25 minutes.
Great, thanks. Let me. Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us today. I'm going to present a paper which is titled Beware the Side Effects, Capital Controls, Misallocation and Welfare. I will set the timer. Which is co-authored with Sofia Bauducco, Evangelina Dardati, and Enrique Mendoza. So let me begin by taking stock a little bit of what we know and what we don't know about capital controls and some key trade-offs. So capital controls on inflows particularly have gained favor as macroprudential policy tools since the 1990s, particularly with the sudden stops in the emerging market economies, and then again after the 2008 global financial crisis. And there are also empirical and theoretical justifications for these advantages, let's say, of the capital controls. And the thing is that it has been proven that they reduce the severity of crisis and improve welfare by weakening pecuniary externalities and credit booms. However, since they are very much like capital tax distortions, they also have efficiency and growth negative consequences or trade-offs. Also, empirically, it has been shown that higher financing costs triggered by capital controls have large heterogeneous effects on firms. So, with all this background, there are still two key unanswered questions that we will hope to address with this paper. The first one is whether there are significant side effects of capital controls on misallocation, and the second one is what are their implications for social welfare. So, what do we do in this paper? Well, what I'm going to do is to provide some theoretical, quantitative, and empirical answers to these questions. And so we are going to address the issue through analyzing a small open economy that has several interesting features that we will focus more in detail later. We take this economy and we calibrate it to the Chilean economy. Why Chile? Because we are going to focus on the effect of the unremunerated reserve requirement that the Chilean government implemented between 1991 and 1998. Basically, this was like a capital control on inflows. So it aimed at from all the inflows that were getting to the country, 20 to 30% had to be kept at the central bank without being paid any interest rate for a period between 6 to 12 months, depending on the year that we are looking at. So we are going to quantify the effects on this model, considering a stationary equilibrium, and we'll see the consequences in terms of marginal revenue, productivity of capital, misallocation, and welfare. And then we will also complement the analysis with an empirical analysis using Chilean panel manufacturing data from 1990 to 2007. We have a series of different findings. So we first try to push the model analytically and try to understand what we can learn in terms of misallocation. So there I will show you that actually there is more misallocation in the regime with capital controls respective to the regime with no capital controls. And there are going to be changes that go through the static analysis, dynamic analysis, and general equilibrium. But then the issue is that, as you can see from the arrows, some are increasing misallocation, some are going to reduce misallocation, and there are some other effects that are ambiguous. So we move to the quantitative analysis to give a quantitative answer. And actually what we find is that misallocation worsens slightly after the introduction of the capital control. But more interestingly, what we find is that this effect is heterogeneous. So we find that high productivity firms, exporters, and young firms, they see an increase, significant increase in the level of misallocation, whereas misallocation is going to be reduced for low productivity firms and non-exporters. We also find that there are large social welfare losses of around 2.4% in terms of consumption equivalent. And there again, we find this pattern that more productive firms are more effective than less productive firms. There are strong general equilibrium effects in terms of consumption, output, and prices, both for labor and for goods. And then I will not be able to show you, but you can see it in the paper, we compare to a situation where instead of using the capital control, we introduce a loan to value, we increase the loan to value ratio, calibrated to trigger, let's say, the same aggregate credit reduction that it is achieved with the capital control. And we find that actually this is a less costly policy. From the empirical analysis, we learned that actually in the data, we find the same type of patterns. So we see that misallocation increased relatively more for high productivity firms, exporters, and young firms. So let me begin by presenting you the model. The model is a small open economy model with heterogeneous firms and credit constraints. And there we have 4 types of agents. We have the heterogeneous entrepreneurs, which are going to be our key players. They will produce differentiated inputs using Ecoff-Douglas technology and under monopolistic competition. They will die with a certain probability, and they are heterogeneous in terms of the productivity. So when they are born, they draw a productivity set that is going to be fixed throughout their lifetime. And they will supply labor inelastically, and they choose whether to export or not, okay? Then we have the final good producers that they will purchase the inputs of these intermediate goods from domestic and foreign entrepreneurs, and they will produce a final good using a CES technology. From the rest of the world, we also have foreign good producers, and they determine our credit market, okay? So they are going to be determining the world interest rate and providing financing for the economy. In this economy, we have a government, which is the one that is going to impose a capital control, which is going to be a tax on inflows, okay? And then the government also provides initial level of capital for entrepreneurs, which is financed with a lump sum tax. So let me go a little bit more in detail in terms of trades and financial distortion. So these entrepreneurs, when they are born, they are non-exporters, but they can choose to export. But this decision is going to be reversible, okay? So they can choose to become exporters, if they want to start to export, they have to pay a sunk entry cost equal to F, and which is expressed in terms of labor cost. And so they pay F in T in order to become an exporter in T+1. And they also face a trade iceberg cost, which is equal to a fraction tau of exports. In terms of the financial constraints, in our baseline economy, we have a collateral constraint that restricts entrepreneurs to borrow less or equal to a proportion theta of their capital tomorrow. And then we will be playing around with this capital control regime. So it will not be active in the baseline economy, and then we introduce the capital control and evaluate the consequences, okay? So this capital control, as I told you, it is like a tax on borrowing. So we will have two different interest rates once the capital control is in place. If entrepreneurs are borrowing, they are facing this higher interest rate, and this is also affecting the price of the bonds, of the assets. Whereas if they are saving, they face directly the international interest rate. Okay. So there are a lot of equations here, but most of them are familiar. So what I'm showing you are the utility function, which is constant relative risk aversion, and then the different constraints and demands that the entrepreneurs are facing. So I don't have to show them again when I present the problem of the entrepreneur. So the demand functions are coming from the final good producers domestically and internationally, okay? And these are the demand functions that our entrepreneurs are facing. The technology, as I told you, is Cobb-Douglas, and they use the same technology to produce goods that they sell domestically and internationally. The evolution of capital is very standard. Then we are going to define the net worth as the difference between capital and the level of debt. And we are going to follow the methodology in Buera and Moll, and we are going to define this cash on hand, which is going to be very useful in terms of the quantitative analysis, because now we will have this cash on hand M as a single state variable that we are going to use in our problem. And using this cash on hand definition, we can rewrite our budget constraint as we have it here, which is that consumption is going to be equal to the difference between the cash on hand and the choice in terms of assets. So basically except with the utility function, these are going to be all the constraints that we will consider in the problem that I will show you now. So this is the problem of the entrepreneur. So remember that the entrepreneurs, when they are born, they are non-exporters, okay? So as long as they continue to be non-exporters, every period they have to choose the situation that gives them the highest payoff, whether to continue to be non-exporters or to switch and become exporters, okay? And then each of these value functions is going to be different depending on the status of the entrepreneur. So we have a two-stage problem that is going to have to reflect the situation whether the entrepreneur is non-exporting and continue to be non-exporting. Whether it is exporting, when they are exporting, they can no longer go back to the previous situation. And then there can be a situation when they are deciding to switch. And this is different because exactly at this point, they have to choose, they have to pay, this fixed cost to become exporters. So how do we solve this? Well, since we are going to use this trick of using only one state variable, what happens now is that there are two stages. First, the entrepreneur chooses the level of net worth in order to maximize their lifetime utility. And then given the level of net worth, in the second stage, they choose they maximize the cash on hand given the level of net worth, and that means choosing capital, the level of debt, and the prices that they are going to have for their goods. So now that we have the setup, I will move to show you the results. And if you remember, I told you that there are like different sets of results. First, we'll try to learn as much as we can analytically. Then we'll move to the quantitative analysis, and then we'll move to the data. So analytically, I will show you what we can learn from the second stage. So remember, in this second stage, we have a certain level of net worth, and we are choosing capital and the amount of debt, okay? So from here, we will consider three different equations, three different economies, sorry. We'll consider economy with no financial frictions. to have as a benchmark to try to understand what's going on in terms of misallocation. Then I will show you separately what happens if we have capital controls or if we have collateral constraints, and then we'll put everything together. So this is the economy with no financial frictions. So we have on the horizontal axis the level of net worth, and this K upper bar is the state optimum level of capital of the firm, okay? So if there are no financial frictions, the firms are going to jump directly to the optimum level of capital. And there, the marginal revenue productivity of capital is given by the price times the interest rate plus the depreciation. And this is going to be our reference point, let's say, the efficient level of capital, the efficient level of marginal revenue productivity of capital. What happens if we move to the economy where we have the collateral constraint? Well, here now, the decision in terms of capital will depend on the amount of net worth that the entrepreneur have. Because if they have a lot of net worth, they can jump directly to the efficient level of capital because they are not facing the collateral constraint. But when they are in this area where you see the blue line, what's going on is that the amount of net worth they have is not enough to jump directly to the level of capital of state, and they are facing the binding collateral constraint. So they will accumulate capital as much as it is allowed given the collateral constraint. And we have this area where actually capital is lower, and the marginal revenue productivity of capital is going to be given by this expression where we are reflecting the binding collateral constraint, and which is larger than the efficient level. So we already see that we have dispersion in this sense. If we have the capital control only, okay, the situation gets more interesting. Now, remember that the entrepreneurs are facing a higher cost of capital when they want to get debt, okay? So they are facing this cost of capital, and this is going to determine a level of capital of state, let's say like a pseudo level of capital of state, which is given by this expression here. So initially the entrepreneurs, if they have to contract debt in order to get to the level of capital of state, they will only jump up to this point because they perceive this higher cost of capital, okay? Once they reach this level, they find it optimal to start repaying debt. And eventually they reach a point where they have zero debt. From there onwards, they do see the higher level of capital of state because now they are no longer facing the capital control because they are not contracting debt. So they want to get to this point, but they are in a situation of pseudo-autarky because they cannot really borrow. If they borrow, they go back to facing the higher cost of capital. So what they do is they continue accumulating capital as in autarky, basically using only their savings. So remember, our objective is trying to compare what happens if we introduce the capital control in a situation where we already have the collateral constraints, okay? So what I have here is the graph that I presented before when we have only the collateral constraints. And in red, we see the line where we are combining the capital control. You can see the kink here that we had before. This is the autarky we had before, with the collateral constraint. So instead of having the vertical line here, we have this ray, which is reflecting the collateral constraint with the capital controls, okay? So what we see is that we have this difference between the blue and the red areas where capital is lower, and therefore the marginal revenue productivity of capital is larger, okay, than with respect to the efficient level. So what this is doing is triggering misallocation because we have dispersion in terms of the different marginal revenues productivity of capital. So this is the static effect that I have told you that it was going to increase misallocation, but then we also have dynamic and general equilibrium effects. In terms of the dynamic, what happens is that once we introduce the capital control, capital becomes more expensive, of course, and that triggers an over-saving effect because entrepreneurs, they want to get rid of the capital control and they want to get rid of the collateral constraint. So they move faster and they save more. So basically what's happening is that they are shrinking this area where we have misallocation. So this means that actually this dynamic effect is going to move in the opposite direction from the static effect. And on top of that, we have changes in prices through general equilibrium effects. And that is going to be changing the optimal scales of firms, and that can also move in one direction or in the other. So overall, the effects on misallocation and welfare are going to be ambiguous, and that's why we move to do a quantitative exercise calibrating this economy to Chile. The calibration is very standard, and it does work well, so I will skip that part. Let me just mention how we calibrate the capital control. So there is a paper developed by De Gregorio where he shows that you can translate this unremunerated reserve requirement into a tax, just like the one we presented in the model. So basically you are adding a tax to the interest rate. So we calibrate that to the average tax equivalent of the Chilean encaje throughout the period, and that's around 2%. So basically to the interest rate, we are adding a tax of 2%. These are the general equilibrium effects that they move in the expected directions. Let me move to show you what happens in terms of misallocation and welfare, okay? So we are going to measure misallocation as the square root of the integral of square residuals from the marginal revenue productivity of capital with respect to its efficient level. And welfare is going to be measured as the compensated consumption variation in the utilitarian social welfare function. And this is what we find in the model. So this is the aggregate effect for all firms, okay, sorry, the first line, and then we are opening up for different types of firms according to different characteristics. So when we look at misallocation, the aggregate effect in misallocation is not that large, it's around 0.11%. We still do see an increase in misallocation. But what's more interesting is that we see that there are very heterogeneous responses when we consider high versus low productivity firms, exporters versus non-exporters, and young versus old firms. So what we see is that misallocation increases a lot for high productivity firms, exporters, and young firms, where it decreases for low and non-exporters. And this goes in line with the intuition that we had and what we were presenting before. What we see is that actually high productivity firms and exporters are typically firms, and young, sorry, are typically firms that they have more financing needs. So they are going to be more exposed to the capital control, whereas the opposite is true for low productivity firms and non-exporters. If we consider welfare, there is a large welfare loss of around 2.4%, but then when we disaggregate the groups, we see the same type of pattern. The welfare loss is much stronger for high productivity firms and for low productivity firms. Okay, time is fine. Okay, we can also disaggregate in terms of high and low productivity firms and look more in details, but I will use the last minutes to jump to the empirical analysis. So what we want to do here is to evaluate the empirical relevance of this type of heterogeneities and see whether in the data we find that the effect of capital control is shaped by this same type of characteristics. So we are going to use data on Chilean manufacturing establishments from 1990 to 2007. This is basically like a census data. So we have all manufacturing firms with more than 10 workers. This is around 5,000 firms per year. And we have data on capital stock, investment, workers, sales, and exports. We are also going to use the same methodology to measure the tax equivalent of the capital control by year that we use in the model, but now we do have it by year. We are not imposing the average, of course. So this is our baseline econometric model. So what I have here is the interaction of the capital control with three alternative measures, which are the relative TFP of the firms, which is the relative ranking of each firm within its own industry. We are going to interact it with whether firms are exporters or not. So it is equal to 1 if firm is exporter and 0 if it's not an exporter. And then we are interacting it with a young. So young is equal to 1 when the firm age is lower or equal to 10. And then we have a series of controls at the firm level. Of course, we have the direct effects of the three variables that we consider. We also have other firm level control variables, and we are going to introduce firm fixed effects and time fixed effects. So that's why we are not observing the direct effect of the capital control, okay? What we are capturing here is only the heterogeneity on the effect. I will show you just the baseline regression. Of course, we are including the controls, we are not reporting them, but these are the coefficients of our interactions of interest. So what we find is that actually the effect of the capital control on misallocation is larger for more productive firms when firms are exporters and when firms are young. And we do have a lot of robustness checks for this. So we also open up for, by using subsamples of high and low productivity firms, we are using alternative definition of exporters. So in the regression that I've shown you, we have like a backward definition of exporters. We are considering as exporting a firm that exported in the previous 2 years. We also do it considering as exporter, a firm that is going to export in the next 2 years. The results are the same. We also include the interaction of the firm's characteristics with macroeconomic controls, and the results are robust to this. Very importantly, we also use a panel of balanced firms, because we want to make sure that our results are not driven by the decision of entry or of exit of the firm, because this could be affecting the results, and our results are robust to this. And we also have another series of controls, so of robustness check. So just to conclude, what we show is that capital controls affect misallocation produced by pre-existing collateral constraints via static, dynamic, and general equilibrium effects that work in different directions. Once we move to the calibrated model, we see that actually capital controls worsen misallocation for high productivity firms, exporters, and young firms, whereas it improves for low productivity firms and non-exporters. We also see that there are strong general equilibrium effects, reducing real wages, consumption, and output, and that there are large social welfare losses, that they also replicate this pattern of high productivity firms being more affected. I didn't have time to show you the loan to value ratio result, but then in terms of the empirical analysis, we see that the empirical evidence is consistent with the model's prediction regarding adverse misallocation effects for high productivity, exporting, and young firms. So that will be it.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So I was just thinking that you only allow firms to be exporters, and you don't think about firms that are importing. So you have like the exporters and the non-exporters, but it's not clear the non-exporters can be just producing non-tradables, or in principle, they could be importing something. It's not implicit in your model. What I'm thinking is that these social welfare laws that you're finding is not necessarily there, in the sense that when you apply capital controls, they can be applied to inflows or outflows, and usually it's kind of two sides of the coin, and they're always kind of winners and losers. And so if you're only looking at the exporters and how they are affected by these capital controls, you're going to be missing what's going on with the importers, because in the net, you know, like when you have the controls of capital outflows and inflows in the net, you're either having a net control to inflows or a net control to outflows. And so whoever, some of them win and the others lose, basically. So sometimes, you know, when it's a zero-sum game, for example, right? It will kind of even out throughout, meaning some, you know, as I said, some win, some lose. Here, the way it's modeled, in a sense, it's kind of a situation where by construction, they will only be losers, no? Am I wrong about that?
Well, I didn't have time to show the general equilibrium results, but what's interesting is that actually, because it's part of an agenda, and actually exporters, they actually are benefited by the capital control. So what happens is that they become more competitive. So once you introduce the capital,
this is because the capital controls are to inflows, right? In the
yes,
net, what you said, right?
yes,
Exactly.
yes, they are only on inflows. So
Okay.
that's also interesting because actually they are benefited, and we see that exports increase, but instead, even with that aggregate result, we do see that their welfare is going down. The welfare, no, because we do not have analysis in terms of welfare here. We do see that misallocation is larger for them. So it's not that the capital controls are constructed to affect exporters. It does affect them because they have a larger optimum size, so they are more.
It's
more
crowding out the
exposed.
consumption, right? So basically they're exporting more, so what they produce goes outside, so inside the consumption goes down, and that's what affects the welfare, right?
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
And so in that sense, I think that because you have a net, control to inflows, well, I guess it could be even larger, right? I don't
If
know.
you have
We can talk later when we talk about the other paper with the.
Okay,
But I
great.
think that and maybe I'll show you my paper and you'll see why I'm thinking about this. But because I think this is very interesting. So yeah, we can talk about it later. But I think that there's something about the how they net off, in the general equilibrium that is kind of a little bit strange.
Okay, great. Well, but thanks in any case for the question. So I will stop sharing.
Okay. Okay, so. Can you see it? Okay. Okay. Do you see when they move? Because a lot of times they're not moving. Fantastic. So this happens a lot of times. I don't know why.
And we are not seeing it in full screen yet. I still see the.
It's not a full screen yet? Let me do it again. I don't know why. There?
Yes, now it's full screen.
Now it's full screen. And does it move?
And it's moving, yes, great.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so so this is joint work with Leo Haney, Mark Wright, and Diana Van Patten. And so the usual disclaimer applies. So none of the views expressed here represent the views of the Fed, either St. Louis, Minneapolis, or the system. So basically, when we look at Bretton Woods, which was this very big agreement that took place in 1946 among 44 countries around the world, we see that all the thousands of studies, because if you go to JSTOR and look at how many studies there are on Bretton Woods, there are literally 25,000 papers. And most of these papers, or nearly all of them actually, are focusing exclusively on nominal exchange rate policies. And because, of course, the system, what it implied was that there was a currency of reference. The currency of reference ended up being the US dollar. The currency of reference was pegged to gold. And then there were fixed exchange rates from all the other currencies with respect to the US dollar. And so in order to be able to maintain those fixed exchange rates, a lot of capital controls had to be implemented. So basically we have two sides of the coin. We have the fixed exchange rates on the one hand, and then the capital controls which were being implemented in order to sustain those fixed exchange rates. And so when we look at these 25,000 studies, literally pretty much, what we see is that all of them are about the effect of the fixed exchange rate policies. And there's very little analysis to none with respect to the restrictions on international capital mobility. So we think that this is a very important open question, because we know that Bretton Woods has been by far the largest experiment in imposing impediments to capital mobility. And so we want to try to understand this better. So in order to do that, we develop a general equilibrium multi-region model where we analyze the positive and the normative effects of Bretton Woods, and we focus especially on the impediments to international capital mobility on the world economy. And what is really neat, I think, is that we're going to be able to separate out the impact of the international capital mobility impediments and the exchange rate effects. So we're able to disentangle both and look at just the capital mobility issues. And what we find is that the Bretton Woods impediments to international capital mobility reduce world output, they significantly reduce US welfare, but they increased it for Europe and the rest of the world. So there were some winners and some losers. And so the big question is, we know that when the agreement was being negotiated and designed, it was being negotiated and designed mainly by two parties. One was Harry Dexter White, who was on the behalf of the US, and Keynes on the behalf of Europe. And at the end of the day, the US had a lot more bargaining power than did Europe. So Harry Dexter White had a lot more influence on the treaty. And something that reflects this is that at the end, the US dollar ended up being the currency of reference. Keynes wanted to create a new currency that would have been called the Bancor, and that would have been the currency of reference. But at the end, that was not the case. So given that we know that the US had a bigger bargaining power on the agreement, the US dollar was the currency of reference. That was the currency that was pegged to gold. Then how come that the US lost more welfare and Europe and the rest of the world gained? So the main question that arises to us when we see these results are, well, was it that the US did not realize that they were going to be the big losers from the agreement, or did they do it on purpose? And when we go back and read history, we basically realize that they were very well aware of the costs that they were going to incur. So basically, we interpret the US welfare laws as a cost of attempting to preserve international economic and political stability based on US international political goals during the Cold War. And I'll talk about this further at the very end. So I'm going to kind of skip this part. Something that is important here is that from an institutional standpoint, Bretton Woods was very complex because at the point of in 1946, when it was created, the IMF was created and the World Bank was created. The IMF was the one created in order to control speculative capital flows. And so when I tell you guys that that exchange rates were fixed, and in order to maintain those fixed exchange rates, a lot of capital control impediments had to be put in place. That's what the IMF was there for. So the IMF was there in order to implement all of those controls with the individual countries, such that countries did not make any unilateral decisions on how to implement those controls. And the World Bank was created in order to reconstruct Europe and basically transfer resources for the reconstruction. So given this complexity of the system and so on, what we're going to do is that we're going to apply international business cycle accounting to capture all the Bretton Woods policies. For those not familiar with the business cycle accounting methodology, I'll be more clear about this in a moment. And so we're going to follow Chary-Kehoe-McGrattan, 2007, which is a closed economy setting. And then in our work with Lee and Mark in 2018, we extended their work to an open economy setting, so to account for capital flows. And we're going to show how Bretton Woods exchange rate controls and international capital mobility impediments show up as one single distortion in one of the model's first order conditions. And we can separately identify the role of international capital mobility impediments from fixed exchange rate effects from this one distorted first order condition. So let me jump straight to the model. So in the model, we're going to have, so think about a situation where you have 3 countries, okay? And each country is going to be a region. So one of the countries is the US. The second country is Europe, which is really represented by Western and Northern Europe. And then the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is mainly Latin America, the Asian tigers, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, okay? So that's kind of how to think about our groups of countries. So these 3 regions are going to be indexed by J, and the problem of regions J representative household is going to be to maximize their expected discounted present value of their utility function, which depends on per capita consumption, so C is consumption, N is population, and hours worked, which is age here. And they're going to maximize that subject to a flow budget constraint for each state and date, which implies that consumption plus new capital goods, which are priced at a price PK, plus international assets. So these are state contingent bonds. So this detail is important from a technical perspective. So we have complete markets, okay? So B are state contingent bonds, and Q is the price of those bonds, which includes the probability of that state arising. So that's why we're able to write this in the left-hand side as the expected value in period T of the price of the bonds times the bonds themselves. And this has to be less or equal than their income. And so what they're going to earn is they're going to be working. So for their work, they're going to work H hours for a total population of N, and the wage is W. Then they're going to face a domestic labor market distortion, okay? And that domestic labor market distortion is denoted by tau H. This distortion is isomorphic to a tax on labor income. Then we have capital, and capital goods, or all capital goods, are going to be priced at a price P star K. So note that all capital goods K and new capital goods KT plus 1 are priced at different prices, right? So there's the difference between PK and PK star. I'll tell you in a moment what's the difference between those two. And the return to capital is denoted by RK. Once again, we have that in domestic capital markets, we have a distortion, which we introduce over here, denoted by tau K. And this distortion on domestic capital markets is isomorphic to a tax on the return to capital, okay? Then we have, and this is kind of what's different from the international business cycle accounting literature, which is the open economy side to it. So once again, we have state contingent assets here, but these state contingent assets are going to face a distortion, an overall distortion that is going to be composed of 2 terms. And here's the crucial thing basically about what we're going to do. So this international distortion is composed of tau star B, and this tau star B is isomorphic to a tax on the return to international assets. And then we have psi here, but psi here is a portfolio adjustment cost. And so here's the detail that is kind of different, which is whenever you have a small open economy model and you have complete markets like we do here, there's no issues with closing the model because we know that consumption can be pinned down from the relative wealth of one country to another. However, here, because we have introduced this distortion here, specifically the tau star B, which is time varying, this is going to introduce a non-stationarity in consumption in the long run. So even though we have complete markets, we still have this non-stationarity, and we have to regain that stationarity by closing the model somehow. So we introduce this portfolio adjustment cost over here to do so. And I'll talk more about what this is in a moment. So, but however, what I want you guys to remember is that the international distortion is composed of these two elements, and we are going to be able to disentangle the two. And what we're going to really care about, because what is really reflecting the impediments to international capital mobility from Bretton Woods is going to be our tau star B. The portfolio adjustment cost is a technical necessity in some sense, okay? So apart from that, we're going to have Ricardian equivalence. So everything that is taxed by the government is rebated to the household, and they also earn the profits from domestic firms. On the consumption goods sector, is completely standard. They hire labor and capital and produce according to a Cobb-Douglas production function. And on the investment goods sector, it's also kind of our usual situation. The only difference is that we have investment adjustment cost, as is standard anyways on international models. And here's where you can tell the difference between the PK and the P star K, right? So the price of the old capital goods and the price of the new capital goods is just due to the existence of these investment adjustment costs, which are just a technical necessity. Okay, then finally, the resource constraint just states that the sum of consumptions plus the sum of investments plus the sum of government spendings has to be equal to the sum of the output of the three regions. And note that here, net exports are netting out basically, right? Or the bonds are summing out to zero, okay? It's a zero sum situation. Okay, so I'm going to kind of brush through these technical details. Basically, we have to take a stand on growth because this was a period of time where the world grew at a pretty fast rate and the regions grew at different rates. So it's kind of, we had to take a stand on how to model it. So what we do is that we take the US population and productivity, and we assume that they evolve according to a random walk with drift, okay? So these two stochastic processes are just random walks with drift. And what happens is that we assume that for Europe and the rest of the world, in terms of population and productivity, they inherit the growth rate of the US population and the growth rate of the US productivity, but that is modified by a stationary component, little a or lowercase a and lowercase n. And this stationary component is basically going to scale up or down that growth rate that they inherit from the US, such that obviously, you know, the rest of the world during some time is going to be growing at a faster rate than the US, but the level is lower. Likewise with Europe, okay? Apart from that, all other, you know, taxes or controls are going to behave as AR1s. So there's no big deal with those. Because we have this growth rate in productivity and population in the US, then all variables have to be scaled by a stochastic trend in effective population according to, you know, this equation here. And after the trending, what is important is that the population and the productivity in the US, their growth rate is now stationary, okay? So this growth rate is now stationary and is IID. The last detail to be able to achieve stationarity is that, as I mentioned before, because now we have this tau star B that is time varying, then we have a non-stationarity in long run relative consumptions. So as well as introducing the portfolio adjustment cost psi that is going to be exactly equal to this term here. And as you can see, it does depend on the international distortion per se and the growth rate, the relative consumption of the regions to the rest of the world. We have to also assume that the steady state of the international distortion is equal to 0. So basically in the long run, we have to assume that there is no international distortion. Okay, so the optimality conditions, in terms of the labor leisure condition, it looks completely standard. The Euler equation for domestic capital as well, for those who are familiar with the international business cycle accounting. But what I want you to focus on is this third equation over here, the Euler equation for state contingent international assets. So basically here we have our international distortion that we talked about, and note that this is fully identified by the growth rate of consumption of a country, okay, of country J. However, because we have complete markets and the 3 regions share a discount factor, so beta is the same for the 3 regions and Q is also the same for the 3 regions. Note that we cannot separately identify this distortion for the 3 countries. So we're only going to be able to identify this distortion relative to one of the countries in particular. So we're going to identify it relative to the rest of the world. And so the last thing is to note that we argue that this tau B star represents impediments to international capital mobility that change incentives and opportunities and to buy and sell foreign assets, because it directly affects, right, or is determined by consumption smoothing, okay, but your ability to change the growth rate of consumption and hence do consumption smoothing over time. So up to now, note that at the very beginning, I told you guys that we were going to be able to disentangle the exchange rate effects from the capital mobility impediment effects. But in the model that I just showed you, there are just like no exchange rates, right? It's a completely real model. So now let me show you what would happen if we were to extend the model to have tradables and non-tradables, okay? So think about the model that I just showed you, but we're going to extend it as in Backus-Smith 1993. So think Backus-Smith meets the 3-country neoclassical growth model. And so now the problem of regions J representative household is to maximize the same utility function we had before. The only difference is that now consumption is not one single tradable good, but is now a bundle of a tradable good X and a non-tradable good D. And so now how this changes is that when we take the first order condition with respect to international assets B, what we're going to get is the following. So before, in the model without the non-traded goods, what we had is, because remember that I told you from this equation, right, that we could only identify this relative to one single country. So think about, we can equate this equation, let's say, for Europe and the rest of the world, the US and the rest of the world. When we do that, this is what we get. We get this first equation over here, which means that the relative international distortion is equal to the relative growth rates of consumption. However, in the model with the non-traded goods, the Euler equation for state contingent assets is going to imply this second equation over here. Note that the only difference between the first and the second equation is this second term here. This second term here comes from the aggregate price of the traded and the non-traded goods. And so the relative price of one of region J with respect to the rest of the world, where J is Europe or the rest, or the US, sorry, is what defines the exchange rate. So here we basically have the growth rate of the exchange rate. So we have the international capital controls that are identical to the model where there are non-traded goods times the exchange rate effects, okay? And so this would identify an international distortion in the context of a model where there are traded and non-traded goods. Now, what is really nice is that the international distortion in this model with non-traded goods is multiplicatively separable between capital mobility component and the exchange rate component. And so because that's the case, we can actually quantify the contribution of capital mobility impediments and exchange rate effects, because we can take data, because we have data on consumption and population, right, to evaluate this component exactly. And we have data on exchange rates, so we can also evaluate that component exactly. So then the question is, are these two different components uncorrelated? Okay, are they orthogonal to each other? Well, we can evaluate this, right? Because we can just run regress the log of the international capital control, so the log of the first component here, on the log of the exchange rate effects, and see what's the R squared that turns out from that regression. It turns out that it's roughly 0. So they are uncorrelated. So given that they are uncorrelated, we argue that this allows us to focus on the model without non-traded goods, where the international distortion is fully identified by international capital control. So it's just this term over here, okay? So once we do that, so think we go back to the model without non-traded goods, so the very first one that I showed you. And what we do is that we do a log linear approximation around the steady state. It's a second order because we're going to calculate welfare. We're going to set some parameters governing preferences, production, and adjustment costs. They're very standard in the literature, but then we're going to estimate using maximum likelihood the rest of the parameters, mainly the ones governing the different distortions on the different margins of the model. And what we get is that we're going to estimate the model perfectly identified such that the benchmark results fully account for output, consumption, hours, investment, population, and net exports. Okay, so I'm going to skip through this. So let me show you the following. So when we measure distortions, when we basically back out from the model the different distortions in the different margins, what we care about is mainly the international distortion, okay? So if you remember, when I denote by theta B over here, this distortion, this incorporates two elements. One, the tau B star, which is the international impediments to capital mobility, and the psi, the portfolio adjustment cost, okay? So this is what we have here is those two elements. Focus on the solid line, which is just a trend, an HP trend of that international distortion, which is very high frequency. So in order to see the level that it has, just think about the fact that any value greater than 0 implies a tax on foreign saving. A value lower than 0 would imply a tax or a distortion that is isomorphic to a tax on foreign borrowing, okay? And this is fully identified off of relative consumptions. The main thing that I want you guys to take away from here is that there's a change here. There's a structural change in 1973. We actually estimate that, so I'm not going to show you all the details because I don't have time. But when we estimate a Markov regime switching model and we allow for the model to estimate if there's what's the year of the switch, and if the switch is in terms of the mean and or the standard deviation, we find that yes, there was a switch in 1973 in both the mean and the standard deviation, which tells us that our distortion is really identifying the Bretton Woods agreement really well, because Bretton Woods ended in 1973 and it looks very different before and after. And so given that, we recover just the tax component or just the impediment to international capital mobility component, and it looks like this. What matters here is that the values here for this distortion are below 0, meaning that there is tax on capital inflows. So there's a tax on foreign borrowing, okay? Then, in order to see what would have happened without Bretton Woods, we shut down this. This Tau star B over here, and we go ahead and see what would have happened with capital flows. So basically, there would have been a lot of capital inflows into the US, a lot of capital outflows from the rest of the world. This is exactly what the US was trying to prevent with the agreement. Total output without Bretton Woods would have been much larger than it was with the agreement. And in terms of the welfare effects, is what I mentioned before, we find that in terms of consumption equivalent welfare, the US was the big loser from the agreement. They lost 4.44% in terms of welfare. Europe won 1.3%, and the rest of the world also gained 4.5%. So the US was the big loser. So once more, what was the intention of the US? Did they know or did not know? Well, it seems like they did know. And what they wanted really was to promote allied reconstruction. They wanted to promote least developed country growth and support friendly governments. They were very worried because in the 30s and 40s, the Nazis and then the Soviets were having a lot of influence on Latin American countries. And so they were really concerned about keeping Latin American countries on their side, basically, on, operating under market economies and not to go to the communist side. So the US viewed international capital markets as prone to crisis. They knew that crisis would drain capital, depress growth, create political instability. And so they wanted to implement these controls to keep capital in these countries. And in order to do all of that, they had to lose some. And so our findings are interpreted as an estimate of the perceived value of these controls in order to support a broader, very expensive international policy agenda. But this is a point that has been overlooked in almost all open economy post-World War II studies. And we think that it seems like integrating political economy and defense goals into international models may shed a lot of light on policy choices and their effects, because sometimes we find results that, as economists, we find surprising or lacking sense. But it turns out, the political side had a lot to do with the decisions made historically regarding, capital controls and so on. So that's it. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Paulina, I was thinking that I really like the presentation and all the effects that you were presenting. But yes, in the last part, I was wondering if maybe within your welfare function, if it is possible to include at least like the most economically part of the argument, the part of the financial crisis, to provide like something that counteracts this negative effect that you are finding, and try to get a little bit closer to what they were actually thinking. I think that for us, yeah, the political part maybe is too complex, but maybe the part of the financial crisis could be introduced somehow in the model, at least in a simplified form, and see if it can provide more rationale for the decision that they eventually implemented.
So what do you mean with the financial crisis?
Because you mentioned that also in, I think that in the, not the last slide of the presentation, but the previous one, you were mentioning that actually through Bretton Woods, they were actually avoiding some financial crisis. So maybe that can be something that can counteract your welfare losses within the context of an economic model.
You mean like what would have happened if the crisis had arisen?
Yes, to counteract the welfare loss or something to get away with the negative, instead of saying just, okay, we find this welfare loss and there can be some explanations of why they still choose to implement this policy. Maybe something related to financial crisis could be something that is easier to include.
Right. So I mean, So I'm trying to understand what you're thinking, because so all these calculations replicate the data one-to-one. It's an exact replication of the data, right? So the model takes the actual observed data around the world, for here we have like 100 and something countries, So we have 75% of the GDP of the world in 1950. And so we take that data, and so we're able, with our distortions that we identify, we fully recover the observed GDP, consumption, hours worked, everything. So, you know, any business cycle effects, anything is there, you know, so recessions, all of that, you know, is there. So, you know, at the end of the 90s in Latin America, the beginning of the 2000s, like all of that is there. So these welfare laws captures all recessions or all crises that happened. I guess that maybe what you're thinking is, well, you're saying the welfare laws might have been even worse if they did not implement those controls, because things might have gone downhill, kind of? Is that kind of what you're...
Like that, because I get a little bit of noise coming from America saying, okay, they knew they were going to lose, and they still implemented it. So I'm trying to think how to reconcile that with what you will expect from the States without getting into something that we cannot explain from an economic perspective. Okay, we can introduce some political concerns, but it's not that easy to model. So yes, it's
it's very hard. Exactly, it's very hard to model. I think the point is that we don't know what would have, I mean, it's kind of strange, right? Because when we look at the counterfactuals in the model, you're exactly right, because we're not taking into account what disaster from a political standpoint would have happened if they, you know, in that case, which, you know, may have, because the model does not include any political economy issues, right? So, so for sure, I mean, that's something that we can't take into account, but that's the point that we make. We think that it would be really interesting to actually be able to model all of that and take it into account, because that seems to have been very important.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I guess at the end of the day, we only had, you know, 3 presenters in the session, but gave us a little bit more time. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Henry, una pregunta, ¿nos podemos quedar acá o tienen que usar las...
No, claro, pueden quedarse. Entonces, en este caso le daría poderes de anfitrión a Paulina y se quedan charlando. No hay ningún problema.
Perfecto.
Super,
¿Listo?
gracias.
Con gusto.
Disculpen, ¿puedo hacer una pregunta antes de salir de la sesión?
Sí, claro.
Qué pena. Sí, bueno, no puedo poner mi cámara por algún motivo, lo siento, entonces pues por ahora ya lo intenté, solo voy a hablar. Es para Victoria, acerca de tu paper. Yo me pregunto, cuando estaba revisando lo que, pues en primer lugar, gracias a todos por sus presentaciones muy buenas, pero bueno, y la pregunta que tenía en particular es sobre tu ejercicio empírico. Yo vi que estabas haciendo un ejercicio econométrico en el cual tomabas un outcome variable que podía ser como crédito o depósitos y lo regresabas en función de la medida de foreign currency control o requirement, si no estoy mal. Y era rezagado, estaba el lag en el right hand side de la ecuación, pero entonces me pregunto si tú hiciste algún control adicional para asegurarte de que fuera exógeno tu instrumento, porque uno podría pensar que hay bidireccionalidad en la causalidad de estas dos variables, ¿verdad? De tanto el crédito al requirement como del requirement a la senda del crédito. ¿Tuviste en cuenta eso en algún grado?
Creo que voy a aprovechar que está Eugenia para no meter la pata, le voy a dejarlo.
Claro que
Eugenia,
sí.
Eugenia
Hola,
es la
Eugenia.
coautora.
Nosotros nos vimos en una conferencia en European Economic Association. Qué bueno verte de nuevo.
No me pareció. Ok, bueno, Camilo, gracias. Sí, eso es lo bueno de estar con esto de la división de trabajo. Voy yo a pedir a mis otros coautores que estén también en las próximas presentaciones. Sí, no, buenísima tu pregunta y claramente es una de los problemas o de las debilidades que puede tener la estimación. Cosas que sí tenemos en cuenta es que pensá que el Reserve Requirement es agregado, digamos, que lo determina el gobierno en forma agregada para todos los bancos y nosotros estamos usando los datos a nivel de banco. Entonces ya como que el moverte más al nivel micro es más difícil pensar que tengas esta causalidad reversa, ¿no? Pero por otro lado también Victoria mencionó lo que nosotros hacemos en uno de los robustness es incluir time fixed effects. Entonces ahí ya digamos como que estamos limpiando la parte del efecto directo y nos quedamos solo con la heterogeneidad. Acuérdate que estaba el efecto directo del Research Requirement y después interactuado por este FFR. Y ahí la heterogeneidad, que en cierta forma, si bien nos interesa el efecto agregado, un poco la parte empírica lo que trata de hacer es tratar de entender cuáles son las heterogeneidades que pueden ser relevantes. Y ahí el efecto de la heterogeneidad se mantiene totalmente robusto, y ese efecto sí es muy difícil que se esté dando como el, digamos,
Claro.
como el otro canal, ¿no? Entonces, eso nos deja un poco más tranquilos, pero totalmente de acuerdo que la parte del efecto directo presenta esas debilidades. Por eso hacemos el ejercicio complementario.
Entiendo, Eugenia. Y una pregunta, cuando hiciste el Time Fixed Effects, si bien recuerdo, eso era uno de los robustness checks, ¿cierto? Pero no era la estimación principal.
Es uno de los robos.
Pero igual el resultado era similar en cuanto cualitativamente. ¿Eso es lo que te refieres?
Claro, cualitativamente es súper parecido. Entonces, si tenés en mente como el gráfico que presentó Victoria de las estimaciones, el tema es que cuando ponemos el Time Fixed Effects, yo no te puedo decir cuál es la ordenada del origen de esas rectas que, pero la pendiente se sigue manteniendo. Entonces eso es como la parte cualitativa del efecto heterogéneo, que es lo que nosotros después tomamos para construir el modelo, tratando de replicar esos insights que nos llevamos de los datos.
Ok, muchas gracias. Gracias por la aclaración a ambos y tengan una buena reunión ahorita. Muchas gracias.
Gracias Camilo por la pregunta.
Hasta luego, gracias.
Chao.
De nuevo.
Voy
Hola.
a intentar sacar a Antonio.
A ver.
Sí.
Ya.
Ahí está. Para que no se ofenda.
Parece que mi perro, pobre, ya.
Bueno, qué
Está
gracias.
muy bueno el paper, Paulina, me gusta como, o sea, hacía mucho que no escuchaba como, que no salía también un poco de mis papers y todo, y esto es como volver, tipo hacía Bretton Woods y pensar desde ese punto, y así como que sí, salir de lo que yo también estaba acostumbrada a escuchar en los últimos meses, así que estaba
Sí, a veces uno no piensa sino en lo, ¿no? A mí me pasa lo mismo.
sí, como volver como esas, o sea, como decir como, ok, vamos a ver desde ahí qué pasó, y como, sí,
Sí, yo ya no veo la hora de terminarlo, ya es como que son también, como el de Rick, los dos me tienen como que ya es como que si tengo que trabajar un mes más en esto me voy a morir.
Eso es,
Sí, exactamente, pero bueno, no, a mí lo que me parece de ese, pues a nosotros nos sorprendió mucho fue el resultado, o sea, esa fue la parte que como duramos mucho tiempo realmente en que pensamos que teníamos algo mal, porque no lo creíamos, o sea, era como que, ok, esto no puede ser, esto es absurdo, ridículo, o sea que entonces de un tiempo paramos y dijimos, bueno, vamos a sentarnos a leer toda la historia de qué pasó, y cuando vamos a leer toda la historia, no estamos mal, de pronto no está mal, resulta que sí, parece que todo es verdad.
los gobiernos usan otra cosa además de mirar el consumo, como que tienen otros intereses.
Claro, porque esto es, lo que es muy sorprendente es que, bueno, la última parte es que no tengo tiempo de mostrarla nunca, es que además cogimos las distorsiones que medimos y mapean súper bien con las diferentes policies que se han implementado en los diferentes países. Si cogemos país por país y calculamos el Tau B-Star de cada país de Europa, por ejemplo, y de Estados Unidos, y uno mira todos los policies que se implementaron a lo largo de esos años, son exactos los picos que encontramos nosotros en la distorsión. Es súper sorprendente. O sea, nosotros ya habíamos en el paper de Lady Abra anterior, que era, lo habíamos hecho ya para el mercado laboral, para el mercado de capitales domésticos y todo, y alineaba súper bien. Pero en el mercado internacional no lo habíamos mirado en detalle. Y realmente la metodología parece que funciona muy bien, es bastante increíble. Así que, bueno, a mí eso me parece muy, muy interesante porque creo que es una forma muy agnóstica de resolver problemas. Sin uno decir creo que es tal cosa o tal otra, es una forma de decir no tengo ni idea qué es y dejar que la metodología, ¿no? Lo defina. Pero bueno. No, hablemos del paper de ustedes.
Sí, Sí, queríamos aprovechar, o sea, cuando te vimos y fue como podríamos pedir a Paulina a ver si nos puede dar como comentarios, aprovechar que ibas a estar. Creíamos que era un poco de no tanto esfuerzo.
Perfecto, perfecto, sí, 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 sí. No, a mí me parece súper interesante. Para mí hay como un montón como de cuestiones como a ver, porque es que una cosa es, yo no tengo claro, desde el punto de vista empírico, qué fracción de los créditos, ¿cierto? Son en dólares en diferentes países. Porque en Perú, que es el que ustedes usan, ¿qué fracción es?
Ahí están los datos, pero yo creo que está todavía como en el 30%, una cosa así.
Y
Incluso
entonces es...
después de desdolarización, digamos, venía como niveles muchísimo más altos, pero debe estar sí con 30-40%.
es un montón, ¿no?
Mm.
O sea, es grande, o sea, es realmente...
La región debe ser de los más altos, ¿eh? Porque además hay un montón de restricciones de que muchos países ni pueden hacer crédito en dólares.
Claro, es que eso es lo que yo estaba pensando, que es que yo inicialmente cuando empezaste a hablar de eso, yo dije, pero yo creería que uno en muchos no puede pedir un crédito en dólares.
Eso es correcto. En la región hay un montón de países que ni podés depositar ni pedir crédito en dólares.
Y no solo porque, bueno, nos vamos a presentar, pero miramos también diferenciando por crédito a firmas y crédito a hogares, y los hogares también sacan créditos en dólares.
¿Por qué rayos sacan? O sea, es como que es desconfianza en la moneda, o sea...
Es como un tema histórico de Perú de que venía muy dolarizado y no logran como tener la confianza en el sol, a pesar de que está así súper estable desde hace 20 años.
Sí, desde que quitaron los últimos ceros, ¿no?
Sí.
Desde esa última vez que lo... ok. Porque es que es todo un tema, ¿no? Realmente, porque es que no es solamente... No es solamente, o sea, lo que estoy tratando de pensar realmente es como en el big picture, ¿no? Porque es algo que parece ser muy puntual de Perú o de algunos países, yo no sé quién más pueda tenerlo, pero al parecer, por lo que me dicen ustedes, no es muy común tampoco
Uruguay.
en la región. ¿Uruguay? Entonces, Perú, Uruguay, porque creo que el tema es un poco más cómo hacerlo como relevante en el big picture, como que la pregunta grande, o sea, que sea como algo que, ok, esto está pasando en Perú y se comporta de esta forma, pero es relevante más en general por X razón, ¿cierto? Y por eso te hice la pregunta al principio, porque, bueno, en mi cabeza lo que pasa es que cuando yo pienso en reservas, en dólares, casi siempre pienso es en reservas internacionales del Banco Central, no como de los bancos en el Banco Central, pero es que yo creo que tienen que estar muy asociadas, porque está este tema del nivel óptimo de reservas, que es complicado, ¿no? Porque, o sea, en realidad no hay ningún paper que yo sepa que realmente haga un buen cálculo de cuál es el nivel óptimo o que tenga una buena metodología para pensar en cuál es el nivel óptimo de reservas internacionales, ¿no? Entonces, yo estaba pensando que en el caso de ustedes, o en el caso, pues, en general, de esos países que aparentemente tienen una fracción del crédito tan grande, esto puede funcionar como un indicador de del nivel óptimo de reservas internacionales, de alguna manera. Porque si uno no tuviera nada de crédito, o sea, uno va a tener como pongámosle que hay un parámetro, ¿cierto? Que va de 0 a 1, que muestra qué fracción de, ¿cierto? Del crédito total es en dólares, ¿cierto? Y ese parámetro probablemente uno podría encontrar el modelo en donde hay un mapping entre ese parámetro y el nivel óptimo de reservas internacionales del Banco Central. Porque ahora el tema de una corrida bancaria no es solamente un tema de la moneda local, sino que estamos hablando de un 30 o 40% en dólares que puede totalmente ¿no? Mandar todo
Pero ahí está el tema, o sea, en el caso de Perú, y yo creo que también en el de Uruguay, sí están como que tienen mucha regulación los bancos y sí tienen depósitos en gran cantidad en dólares también. Entonces, como que, o sea, a ver, no tengo idea lo que vos decís de las reservas internacionales y si eso está cambiando el nivel óptimo de reservas internacionales, pero me imagino que como que el Banco Central también les pasa mucha presión a los bancos privados de decir, tienen que tener como un buen hedge. O sea, y en el caso de Perú sabemos que así era, o sea, como que en el paper de... ¿Quién es? ¿En el de Lorena o es en el otro?
Es en el de Tobal, ¿no? Es el que hablaba de que estaban
Sí.
dados casi como 1 a 1 en algunas cosas.
Sí, exacto. Como que sí tienen regulación para decir, ok, ustedes pueden hacer crédito en dólares, solo si tienen los depósitos para Pactemap.
Esperen un segundo, le hablo a mi perro que quiere salir. Está tocando la campana.
¿Cuál es? ¿Salomé era la chica que había presentado de Minneapolis?
No. Salomao.
Salomao. Creo que en el paper de ella estaba eso.
Puede ser. Sí. No, me quedé pensando en esto de lo del big picture y también quizás como generalizarlo por ahí a economías que no tengan tanto el tema de la dolarización de crédito. Pero sí me parece que puede ser más general el tema de que cuando viene el quantitative easing, ya sea en el 2008 o ahora también con lo de COVID, como que les centran mucho por depósitos, como que en general la parte de los depósitos, acá en Chile, bueno, ahora se disparó con el tema del tipo de cambio, pero lo de los depósitos sí pega mucho. Entonces, igual quizás lo que podemos como explotar un poco más es como el efecto en el crédito total, no solo como el efecto como el foreign credit, porque acá lo que ves es como que te frena como el multiplicador para la cantidad total de crédito y para evitar el credit boom, más allá de la dolarización desde el punto de vista de crédito. Y eso podría ser más general, ¿no? A una economía que esté como con tanto nivel de crédito en dólares.
Claro. Lo que tú dices es que frena el nivel de crédito porque si hay demanda por crédito en dólares, pero no hay suficientes dólares por los depósitos para dar los créditos en dólares, entonces se reduce el nivel total de crédito. Eso es lo que dices, eso es...
Yo lo que digo es que lo que nosotros encontramos es que le ponen el reserve requirement a los depósitos en dólares. También le pusieron a los que no, pero le ponen el reserve requirement a eso. Entonces, como que frenan un poco el multiplicador, la cantidad de crédito que terminan apalancando. Y no solo en dólares, sino que nosotros vemos que cae el crédito total.
Total, exacto.
Entonces, quizás eso puede ser más generalizable a otras economías, que no sea tan específico como lo de Perú, puede ser como un mensaje más general. En el caso de Perú tenemos la parte del efecto en la dolarización, pero por ejemplo, pensando de nuevo en Chile, Chile ahora están en récords históricos los niveles de depósitos en dólares, pero acá no hay crédito en dólares para hogares, ¿entendés? Pero sí podrías extrapolar que decir, si vos pones un reserve requirement ahí, vas a frenar como el credit boom de lo que pase con eso.
Exacto.
Podría ser una forma de hacerlo como más general, no...
Sí, sí, eso me parece interesante. Sí, porque digamos que como que el issue más grande que le veo es como el big picture, ¿no? Porque es que lo que está pasando ahí puntualmente es interesante, ¿cierto? Es bonito. Pero entonces después está un poco el issue, bueno, hay dos cosas. Una, que seguro mucha gente podrá decir, bueno, pero está pasando en Perú y ¿qué nos importa? O sea, si en dónde más puede pasar eso o por qué nos importa que esté pasando allá, le puede pasar a alguien más o cómo puede afectar otro tipo de economía o sí, ¿qué aprendemos de eso? Y pues está un poco el issue del modelo, de la parte teórica, ¿no? Porque el modelo no es capaz de replicar, ¿cierto? No está replicando lo que pasa en el total y en la dolarización, ¿verdad? Replicaba el primero,
Y del total la dolarización replica como el 50% de cada uno. Replica lo que pasa o en depósitos o en crédito, pero no...
Claro, exacto, porque la dolarización eran las dos...
paralelas para
paralelas.
arriba.
Exacto. Pero eso, hacerlo más general, un poco en términos como lo que estaba pensando de pronto Eugenia, también les da un poco más de flexibilidad con lo del modelo, porque como que ya ven más o menos un poco el modelo cómo funciona, entonces el modelo va a funcionar para economías que no tengan esta situación tan así, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que puede hacer un poco como el span entre los extremos y entonces va a capturar muy bien, digamos, una cosa puntual de lo que pasa específicamente en Perú en esa dimensión, pero después las otras o sea, pueden tener que hacer algunos tweaks al modelo también, digo, pero por lo menos el hecho que como que no captura todo perfecto, no importa tanto realmente si están viendo algo más, como más de big picture en general, digamos, más que el asunto puntual de qué pasó en Perú, ¿no?
Mm.
Pensaría yo.
Sí. Y necesitaríamos por ahí como tener datos de algún otro país para ver esto del crédito o no. O sea, si estamos pensando, por ejemplo, en el crédito total.
Pues a mí me parecería súper interesante tener datos de varios. ¿Qué tan difícil es tener esos